The big change in technology as a result of COVID was that so many companies have created e-commerce operations and systems. You know, when the first sanctions and close downs and shutdowns occurred as a result of the government action, many organizations did not actually have a place to distribute their products to, because the brick and mortar stores or their channel, their distribution channel was shut down. So they had to come up with new ways. That means that no longer could they use their existing way to collect an order or to distribute the product, but they had to, and so for many of it was, we have to adopt an e-commerce system. That's for order management and for order fulfillment. And so that's probably the biggest thing. Many organizations were capable of doing that. Some weren't. And many organizations created those new distribution channels that weren't there. It wasn't so much a reliance on new kinds of technology, but it was a technology that was new to them. I mean, e-commerce has been around for a long time, but it was new to them. It's kind of like the old NBC advertisement they used to have. This is years ago. I'm dating myself. You know, it's the, if you haven't seen it, it's new to you. Well, for many of these organizations, they hadn't adopted an e-commerce system, so it was new to them. That meant a big change in their organizations. That's probably the biggest change in terms of technology. Tracking systems, those have improved in capability. Some organizations are using them to their benefit, but it hasn't created a sea change. This is more of an incremental improvement, I would argue. Well, in pre-COVID, there was a dearth of people to fill all the roles in the supply chain. You know, once we had COVID, then it's even worse. So many organizations were very active and all the steps needed to, you know, identify, acquire, you know, develop and retain talent. So talent management became a really important practice, certainly in the supply chain domain. Now, through COVID and post-COVID, it's become even more important. Now, there's all sorts of different kinds of talent, but what can you do to, you know, to deal with that in anticipation? For production operation workers, it's coming up with production processes that does not necessarily require an extensive investment in training. You know, if you have somebody, it takes a year to train them to do a particular job, and they, you know, you train them for a year, and then they stay for 6 months and go someplace else. You know, that's not effective. You know, that's a risk that organizations have. And so what some organizations might be able to do is to either automate or to use use a new approach that would allow them to simplify the task. So make the training less onerous, shorter, so that the employee may not necessarily need to do all these 10 tasks, but maybe just this one task. There was a company that did that a number of years ago. I'm trying to remember the company's name was Helix, and what they did was they made vacuum compressors and pumps for the semiconductor industry. And so there was a lot of cyclicality in that particular industry. What they did was, you know, when it was boom, they needed more employees, and when it was bust, they had to lay people off. And so what they said was, look, we're gonna you know, break down our production process into really simple steps. So if we need to hire somebody, we can hire them, train them in 2 weeks, and then they can do that particular task. And we do that for a number of different tasks. It made it much easier for them to be able to ramp their skill set up and to run it down quickly if needed. Many organizations will use multiple sources as a way to manage risk. Because if you have one source that is producing product in one location, then there's great risk there, because if something happens to that company in that one location, you have no alternative. And so having a second supplier is often a good thing to do. Now, how many more suppliers do you need? Well, it depends on your risk appetite. It depends also on the company's operations. You could depend on one supplier if they had multiple facilities in different locations. That diversifies your risk, because in the sense of at least geographic risk. So if something happens, there's a natural disaster in one area, well, it's not going to affect the other area. But still, you need to have extra capacity. So what a lot of organizations have done and could do is to contract for additional capacity. Basically it's an option. You pay an option or keep a second supplier or a third supplier or a fourth supplier and have them produce product at a low rate, but have a contingency plan with them so that they will increase their capacity to a certain rate upon your giving a signal and trigger. Now, you have to pay some money for that, an option fee, but that's what some organizations do. One of the downsides of that, of course, is that that's all, you want to have 4 or 5 different suppliers. Great. That means you have to manage 4 or 5 different suppliers. That means you have 4 or 5 different suppliers you have to distribute product to in the sense of purchase orders. That means you no longer have the volume benefit and discount that you may get if you concentrated all your purchases with one supplier. So there's a pros and cons to that. There's advantages and disadvantages. If you concentrate all your buy with one, you're going to get the most economies of scale, probably the lowest purchase price, and the most control and power over that supplier. But you're also taking on risk, because if something bad happens to that supplier, and things do, then all your eggs are in one basket, and that's not a recipe for resilience.